So welcome to Big de Boutique. We've got a pretty fun and packed hour for you here. And we know that all of you had a lot of choices in terms of where to be this hour. So we want to make sure to make the most of your time here and really allow you to come away with something that's extremely beneficial and productive for you when you walk out of here. So I want to just hear a couple of you shout out what you'd like to get out of this session. Don't be shy. You don't have to get up on stage or a soapbox here, but why'd you choose to come here? Can just project out to me. Can I get a show? Somebody.
Somebody.
Right here.
There we go.
Do you have any great ideas for convincing our clients that it's important to be resilient?
Perfect.
Great ideas to convince clients how to be resilient. That it's important to be resilient. Okay. I think, do we have a couple? 100?
Yes, we do.
Good.
Of
Okay.
course.
Stick around. So some of the environmental design as it relates to resiliency in the projects. I think we can steer things in that direction. Okay. Oh, in the back. Great. Shout out. Thank you. So some small-scale interventions. Okay. Can emphasize that. Can you guys add a couple slides in real quick? Okay, no problem. Anybody else? Anybody else? Yes. Okay. It's the bright lights. How's resiliency impacting our practice? Oh.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Rock and roll. So good. Thank you. We're going to go through a few geographic regions. One is the Gulf Coast of North America, one is the East Coast, and then we're going to focus on the East Coast of China. So I want to give you guys a chance to just think ahead about those regions, and if there's something really poignant that you want to say, we're just going to have a quick break between those sections, and we want to hear from you. We have an incredible panel here today. Switch to the next slide. Learning objectives, don't forget, you're here to learn. Bree Sarte, principal and founder of Sherwood Design Engineers based in San Francisco.
I'm Alan Lewis with Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. I run the open space design studio within the city design practice out of San Francisco.
And Kai-Uwe Bergman with Big. I'm a partner and was project leader also on the Big U project in Manhattan.
So we convened this panel to provide a pretty dynamic spectrum of perspectives from civil engineering to one of the world's most well-known architectural firms, SOM, and one of the rising stars that's got a global influence. And in our practice, what we've been doing right up until we walked in this room, continuing to field projects and problems and challenges that we're designing and working through. This is just a snapshot in time, and we hope to share that conversation with you in detail. And we think we've picked 3 areas that are pretty interesting and engaging and some real projects there. And I think I've been involved in Greenbuild a long time, this idea of resiliency. What does it mean in the context of sustainability and green building? How do these things mesh? I think sometimes they're at odds and there's a tension to try to define resiliency as something different. I really think it's a layer that adds on and enhances a lot of the intergenerational work that we've been doing with respect to sustainability, and helps us to think in a clear and focused, planned way about some of the immediate and dynamic risks that are coming home in terms of the longer cycle climate risk and other dynamic patterns. And so 3 of those that we're going to focus on is the coastal protection. What are the solutions on the coast that respond to hurricanes and superstorms and all of that intensity that's really brought some of these key issues home for us? How we're going to focus on the riverine floods, how river systems and flooding has changed and creates a dynamic response. And drought to a lesser degree, but an important part to think whole system about the water cycle and how our actual urban systems and ecosystems need to interrelate and operate to be fully optimized. So none of this can really happen without clear and consistent funding, but also policy that's embedded into the system that we operate in. And being able to think about ways to show the costs and the benefits side by side is really important. We've been deeply involved in New Orleans, where we found that a $6.2 billion investment in a green infrastructure provides an incredible local economy with over $20 billion in benefits from not just the direct economic impact and job impact, but also the protection of houses and other things that you would appreciate, as well as a number of other factors, increased property values, et cetera. But to see the whole picture is really essential to be able to garner the kinds of investment. And I think you're going to see some of that as we transition to the other projects. And it really all comes down to individual projects, individual decisions, finding simple economic tools to show that investments in resilient systems is actually producing a positive economic output is critically important. So what do we do now with this information within this context? We're going to take it away and move to the Gulf region here. As I mentioned, this is a place where a lot of the issues around resiliency started the conversation with Katrina and a number of the recurring storms and events that have continued to track. Since 1850, these are the major hurricanes that have tracked through the Gulf region and through Texas in particular, where we're going to focus our next case study. So, Alan?
Yes, thanks. So I just want to go back to this slide for a moment, because you might hear the Southern in my accent come out when I use certain words, but I'm from the Gulf region, and I actually was living in New Orleans during Katrina. So this map is, as a designer, is really a fascinating graphic, but also terrifying, right? And of course, with Katrina, Betsy, Andrew, we have the whole name. And a lot of the dialogue about resiliency is about sea level rise. And what I want to really share with you today is kind of looking back, looking the other way. Like when you're in Hong Kong, look both ways, because actually what's happening is that there are billions of dollars of flood damage that are caused from rivers inland. And so a lot of our work is really focused on how to deal with those communities along rivers upstream. And so as we're thinking about the Gulf Coast, and we go to a city like Houston, growing city, one of the top 5 populations in the country, and dealing with huge impacts on their economy, has to do with flooding, and the flooding of the lake system and the river system of Texas that lead to the Gulf. And so I wanted to share with you a project that was, this was in response to the first question, how do we get clients to understand they need resiliency? This was the other side, where the client had this beautiful riparian site along the river corridor in Houston, and one of the beautiful things about it was the water system and the forest system, and they wanted to understand how they could provide for a dense community close to downtown without doing the typical suburban track home system. So we got to work trying to understand what that actually meant. And this is a map of Houston area, the white dot, where last May they had a series of storms that moved through, one right after the other, kaboom, 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 where they had over 20 inches of rain in a 1-month period. And prior to that, on record, 6.5 inches, 6.6 inches was the highest 1-month recording of rainfall for any given month ever. And in 1 month, they had 3 times that. So one of the points that is really important in the description, and Kai gives a great description about what he believes resiliency is, because we all have a term, but that we typically use these metrics of 100-year storm, 5-year storm, et cetera, but those metrics may change. And until the data's in, we don't know what the metrics are. So this is an example, shows us that, well, there's spontaneity in nature also that aren't, that don't follow our rules. For instance, here we had 3.5 feet of water higher than the normal water level, and that the frequency of floods in this area is now 2.5 times where it used to be every 2 or 3 years. So those rates are increasing significantly. The site, looking at this, I got this, Google's amazing, right? And I don't work there, was the Google image during one of the flood events where the site that the developer wanted to use, and it was a previously impacted site where the surrounding area had come in and ripped out the forest, dug a hole to retain water, but then it took another 3 feet of water onto the site. So one of the ideas was that we actually want to build on previously impacted sites as opposed to clearing forest and digging more holes. So looking at the site going from the 43-foot level, we were able to, by carving into that impacted site, increase the capacity of the site to hold water and retain it within the floodshed before it got to the larger river system by over 2.5%, or sorry, 2.5 times, 260%. And then also at the 4-foot rise, we were able to increase the volume of the site by 5-fold. This is about allowing the land to do what it naturally wanted to do, which was hold water. Because originally, before all the development, water wasn't racing off into the river system by being channelized and pumping. The other thing we wanted to do was take the existing water pattern that had been man-made and constructed to direct the water, was to actually reintroduce the water system back into the site, resuscitate the natural system to allow the water to move through the site the way that it historically had, so that the thriving understory of the forest that relied on that amphibious ecology to then re-support the forest. Then, by creating that movement of water through the site, we were able to not only retain large areas of forest, but hold more water and get the similar kind of densities as if we had cleared the site and just done tract homes. So this was really where part of the vision was to offer a different style of living, a healthier living that had connectivity directly with nature as opposed to the conventional type in this region of the country. I'm sure we all, how many people live or work near a suburban environment? Right? All of us, right? So it's a little bit crazy when we think that originally we had these beautiful stands of old growth forest, and it turns into this for the little houses that are raised up on the land. So this series just shows the forest condition. The conventional method is to come in and do the clear cut, then to dig the hole to hold all the water, use the soil to build up above the floodplain, and everybody's got their 2-car garage. Where the developer really thought that by concentrating the development, there's less impact on the forest, especially if it happens on previously impacted land. You build a tighter footprint, you have a more close-knit community with mixed use and recreation, and you have this immediate access to the natural environment. So you really get this symbiotic relationship between the living ecology of nature and the human ecology that we all really want to have, and at the same time, that increases the property value. So resiliency goes across all those things, from economies through nature, through lifestyle, so that as hard as we all work, we have that comfortable environment when we do find our place at home, and we have a great community to live in. So it's really interesting for me to be working in this region again, and it's really great to be on stage with these guys, because Bree and I have worked together for a long time, and Kai and I have worked together. Our firms have worked together for a long time. So it's really great to see the different stories that we have and the common ground that brought us together. So we really hope that you guys can foster a little bit of fodder for us to get some good dialogue going. So the final issue to think about, and we'll talk a little bit about the smaller scale later, but here it's really important to understand Houston is a microcosm of a much larger water system, a much larger ecology in a state that is water and drought prone. So it's prone to huge flooding, but at the same time, it's prone to huge droughts. So really understanding these dynamics in the larger system and how that can play into the specific project you're working on is really, really important to be able to change those lenses. So back to...
Just a quick sort of zoom into the urban context in Houston. Our Sherwood, we're based in San Francisco and New York, and I thought our next location would be London. That was our business plan, and it turned out to be Houston. And it's a place where we're seeing incredible dynamic change because of just the Texan will to get shit done. Am I allowed to say that? We're being recorded. Oh, thanks. Yeah. And also the critical issues that extend. If you look at this big orange swath on the map, that's one of the primary watersheds in eastern Texas that connects Dallas and Houston. And so these questions around water supply and drought and the back-to-back droughts that have pounded Texas have really started to change the way that the cities are actually dealing with both these increased and dramatic flooding, like Alan showed, as well as these conditions where in Memorial Park, which is the central park in Houston, half of the forest died from these back-to-back drought events. And so how do you rebuild a more resilient forest, an urban forest? How do you change the way that the water flows through the system, through a big node like this, and really capture the restoration of natural habitats and create this idea of more of a sponge-like city where you can absorb these big flows and close the water loops on site, where you can take advantage of the site hydrology and use that to actually catch all the water that you need. On this project, we're capturing 60 million gallons of water. We're using the development around it to fund this $300 million project to actually do this massive conservation restoration project led by Nelson Bird Woltz, a really thoughtful landscape architect nearby, actually. So how do we integrate these big investments in central infrastructure to also build real restorative ecologies to connect both this gray or hidden fabric, the built urbanization, and also create a more restorative ecology? This takes us to the northeast, and I'm going to pass it over to Kai here to expand your minds.
We all, even here in Washington, D.C., I think were affected by Superstorm Sandy. And if you think about just what one storm, what one event actually impacted, it's pretty remarkable. So I'm going to start actually with a video that sort of demonstrates and talks about what we actually did as far as a rebuild by design competition. This was a first of its kind in my sort of 25-year history in the design community. The federal government actually asking for proactive and sort of very long-term improvements that would actually think about resiliency from a big picture. So sit back and watch.
That was actually why Sandy was so bad, is because of the phase of the moon, it was already a very large high tide, as well as the storm surge coming in with the wind and the tide lining up perfectly to give us 14-foot tides instead of 8-foot.
The most shocking part of Hurricane Sandy was the fact that it exceeded expectations.
I think the sheer magnitude of it caught a lot of people off guard.
When Hurricane Sandy came, we were not prepared at all. I mean, not even the slightest.
Yeah, it was like an alien invasion of water. And not the good kind of water.
So yeah, I mean, it came right in front where there was literally boats on 14th Street floating in front of our window.
We had a sub-basement level office a block from here, and it was totally covered in water for 2 days. So we lost everything. Everything.
we're really concerned about another storm and the flooding that's possible, and we think that the next time it's going to come even further inland.
I'd like to see some type of flood protection in this area. That's going to happen. We're vulnerable, obviously, being this close to the water.
Something that just brings like more walks, different walks of life, you know, another escape from just the busyness and the hustle and bustle.
There's this great space that could really become community space, cultural space, and active uses.
Everyone enjoys space. And in New York and other congested cities, it's hard to come by.
If it were only that easy.
Anything that makes the cities greener is just such a wonderful thing for not only the environment, but the people that live in the city too, to be able to be around that space.
The plans, the berming, the sense of how it can become into the natural landscape itself, how we want to program that is really the next challenge. We are the link, we're the tip in the sense of the big U. It's important that the entire waterfront of Lower Manhattan build in the plans that have been put forward, because we can not only fortify this great city of New York, but be a model for cities all over the world.
So that, of course, is a project that is not made by a single office like ourselves. Everyone from Star White House, One, Borough Hauptwald, Level Engineering, everybody that you see there is involved in the creation of this work. And also the Rockefeller Foundation actually financed the entire competition that HUD then selected the winners. It is an interesting competition because there wasn't one winner, there were multiple winners. Basically, they were looking for the best ideas. 140 teams started, 10 teams were selected, and 6 projects were funded to the tune of just under $1 billion. And these projects are actually going forward. So here's the areas that were affected by Sandy up and down the Northeast. Even in New York and the 5 boroughs, you can see the amazing impact that flooding has on the entire coastline. So, you know, we all remember these images of sort of a darkened New York. I lived and worked in this new dark neighborhood, a neighborhood that was actually coined SOPO, or South of Power. And when you looked at the areas that were actually affected, it was actually going back to topographically to the actual Manhattan that the first Pilgrims actually came to. So all of the areas that flooded were all of the successive man-made land interventions on both the Hudson and the East River. And so Canal Street became a canal, and Water Street became the water edge again. So it's something that we sort of see, let land actually act as land wants to. And in our case, in this sort of flooded area where we have this sort of the capital of commerce, we actually were thinking of what can we do in this area to actually deal with this rising sea level and the surges. So we came up with the idea of actually the big U, providing sort of a protective framework that stretches from West 57th to East 40th. And thinking of this as kind of social infrastructure. If you think of the High Line, it's a decommissioned railway with a park on top. So it's providing a social benefit from infrastructure. We think of the Big U very similarly. It's a flood protection system that doesn't forget the humans or our activities. That basically the entire flood system, protection system, actually is a park, a very long 10-mile consecutive park that runs the entire length of Manhattan and is tailored to all of the different neighborhoods that it adjoins. The other interesting thing when you look at the flood zones, there are these little pinch points where the flooding actually did not go as far inland. And so we thought of it, the system, as actually a series of flood systems that could be seen as like the hull of a ship, where if one section floods, it doesn't bring down the entire ship. So our big U is made up of little U's that also help in terms of phasing and funding, so that right now, the first $380 million are actually funding the 2.5 miles that were in the most affected area, the Lower East Side. And that is actually going to be constructed and completed by 2020. So when we think of infrastructure, we think of Robert Moses. When we think of tailoring it to sort of the local community and being sensitive to that community, we think of Jane Jacobs. So in essence, think of a love child between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. That is what we sort of see as the Big U. What is that flood protection? Well, we have to protect for 15-foot sea level rise and even a foot of splash zone. So in many cases, when sort of this is just an engineered solution, then you just build that wall. But that wall, as an urban quality, is not something nice. It sort of separates the city from the waterfront. So we saw it more as urban furniture. It could actually become a theater. It could provide places of walking and seeing. It could provide places of artwork, skate ramps, kiosks. So you name it, this is basically a transformative kind of flood protection system. So in 99.9% of the time, it functions as a place for the city, and in that, those few times, it protects against the sea level rise. So turning basically this through the protection system into something that can actually sustain those successive storms. So this was all done not by us deciding what should be done, but actually listening to the local community. So we mapped out who owns what, both from a city level, from the Department of Transportation to private land holdings. We met with over 100 different agencies, community groups, over a course of about 3 to 4 months. And we sometimes met with them successively so that we had feedback, and then we met with them again to sort of show to them what their work provided. We offered alternatives. So we could look at the cost-benefit ratios of how much does it cost, and what can we do now that successive generations can actually build on. So we, as I mentioned, focused on the Lower East Side, and that's the first 2.5 miles. We asked people, what do they want? They don't want their views blocked. They do want more accessible open space. This is one of the most underprivileged places for open space, the Lower East Side. And so our project became this berm, but it was like a bridging berm. This is the current condition, the FDR cutting the people from the waterfront. So we build more bridges, we build the berm, it turns into sort of stadium seating for the tennis courts. It becomes something that then in successive generations, you could actually cap the FDR and you would actually also gain that open space. So we provide the keystone for opportunities. Taking something like this, a bridge that's completely caged in, and turning it into a very large, almost highline experience across the waterfront. And something that the waterfront then becomes an active part of the Lower East Side, not something that you actually shy away from. That then stretches also around Battery Park, connecting the dots, finding how those floodgates, and this is an RFP that's out right now. They're deciding, the design teams, to actually think of these projects. And some of you even sitting in here are probably taking part in this tendering process. But the hope is to take a situation like this and then to weave in that berm and those protective systems for the future. This is not something that only affects Manhattan. You can even go across the Brooklyn Bridge and see how it affects Brooklyn as well.
Thanks, Kai. Are any of you familiar with Brooklyn Bridge Park? Has Has anyone taken their engagement or wedding photos there? Seems to be what's always happening when I go down there, except on really rainy days like this. It's a site just looking across. The red circle on this map is where Brooklyn Bridge Park is. The Big U is directly across the channel from this park. It faces directly on Manhattan, but it was also a major breach point into the Dumbo neighborhood. And you can see the blue is all the flooding along the Brooklyn waterfront there, all the flood risk areas. One of the things that I'd be remiss in describing is the relationship of this coastal city, now Manhattan fits about in that red circle, to its actual watershed, the Hudson River watershed. And where our water supply comes from, this larger ecosystem context, is a critical interface. And understanding the relationship when we're thinking about water, coastal water, is always dynamically linked to the water that's running off the watershed that's coming out of our cities. So when we're designing these barriers or berms or whatever kind of a system it is, the civil engineering within those systems becomes highly integrated, and understanding that larger opportunity. And as Kai and Alan have referenced as well, this relationship of the ecology is part of that larger restoration thinking. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how to bring these different elements together on the engineering of Brooklyn Bridge Park, which actually was fully up and running, the first phase of it when Sandy hit and inundated much of it. So we had that moment that I think many of you have had mid-design where a major new variable came to play. Oh no, we've got 10 feet of water to deal with here as part of our design effort. So the challenge is, when you're working with something that's really incredible on the waterfront, how do you not lose those things that you really love? This is actually lower left is my daughter collecting beach glass. Above you can see the couple coming to do their wedding shots. This is part of that area where the city, the design team, was tempted to put a big concrete wall. How do we address this huge risk that's impacted billions of dollars worth of real estate? So finding really sensitive and integrated solutions. This is an after shot of that same area. Still finding ways to attract young engaged couples to come. I think this is Sandy and Bob. But also a place for kids to come and play and learn and experience the waterfront for the first time, and not lose that experience is really, really critical and requires that kind of thoughtful design. So we're going to just spin the globe here to China. If you guys are ready, hang on, and talk about the Yangtze
Frequent
River.
flyer miles, yeah.
Alan?
So one of the big issues, of course, how many people have worked in China? A few? Okay. So you've probably run into a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of, it's very hard to get things done. There's a lot of changes in what yes means from one day or one meeting to the next meeting. But one of the interesting things is that like the federal government here in the States jumped in after Sandy and really said we really need to change our thinking about how to deal with these challenges. What's actually happened in China is that there's a beautiful street scene on any given torrential monsoon rain day, is that because of the overdevelopment and the taxing of the infrastructure system, the federal government has sent out a directive which is referred to as Sponge City. And essentially, it requires every development branch of the government in every city to adopt the principles of Sponge City to encourage developers and government policymakers to have a major element of all developments be about nature dealing with water in a more natural way. So by creating the hard conventional infrastructure system of levees, pumps, and pipes, they now want, in conjunction with that, to have Sponge City elements to be an integral part. So that what we end up with is, and this is a project outside of, across the river from historic Nanjing, which is about 200 miles from Shanghai. Shanghai is kind of the New Orleans of China at the delta of the Yangtze River. And so this area, which is about 15 square miles, so it's about the quarter of the size of San Francisco itself, for this new development district. And one of the things was that we were requested to really understand Sponge City and establish the precedent typologies for how to integrate it. And we really looked at it on 3 levels. One is, how do the larger green systems of canalways and city parks help to manage the water, retain runoff, clean water, detain it, allow it to return to the aquifer, as opposed to water just being about disposal back into the river. The second layer was really about the Green Streets program. And back to the detail, the Green Streets program is really about allowing all of the planting along the street corridors to operate as rain gardens, also to employ pervious paving systems, also to integrate those rain gardens with the catch basins. So again, it's this coming together of the 2 systems, because of course, when you go into one of these meetings with the civil engineers, no insult, when you go into I call him my smart civil engineer, right, is that the catch basin has to work. But if you augment it with the natural system, you release water into the aquifer sooner, you don't put the burden on the pump at the end of the line, you create an amenity, and who can argue with that, right? But it does cost more money. And of course they want the sports car, but they don't want to pay for every bolt that holds the wheels on. And so it is an arduous process once you get into the details of how to bring that high-level thinking into the implementation phase. So it's really, really important that the clients understand that this is a longer process. They're learning a new system, and they need to integrate it. So streetscapes are a huge element to carry that water into the city parks, into the canals. And then the third component is really to put the onus on the developer so that they're required to handle a certain percentage of the water on their site. They have to handle 40% of the water has to be either stored for reuse, or they have to clean it and return it to the aquifer, or the other 60% can go into the city system. So again, this is where policy from a top down, whereas here in the States we usually go from the bottom up, unless there's an event that causes us to all go, oh my gosh, or the OMG moment. So looking at this area, again, taking the broader context, this is at the mouth of the Yangtze River. The Three Gorges Dam, everybody's heard about the horrific transformation of that natural system into this series of dams that's literally billions and billions and billions of dollars. But the problem is that on a site like this, where we have both the tidal coming from the ocean up the river, and we also have the flooding coming down the rivers into the sites, burdening those canals, the engineering follows a certain metric, as I mentioned before, right? We all follow those metrics. We all look up the guideposts, but those things change. Here in Nanjing, you guys might remember earlier this year, there was the event where the tour boat on the Yangtze River capsized. That was at this same time period. A tornado on a river in inland China, unprecedented. It had never happened before. There's one. So how is that a metric, right? So this is where the change. And again, the precipitation during this event, these series of events in June, 18 inches of rain in a 1-month period, whereas the average on record before was 6 inches. When you change your requirements as a designer to move from that to 3 times that, the whole world changes. So why wouldn't we build the big U? Like, let's do it, right? And then the metrics are going to change. So much of it is about really, really getting a hold of not the what if in terms of fear, like, oh my gosh, the dragon's gotten bigger, we need to build the castle again, right? But really out of hope. How can we take this information as designers, as leaders, and bring good examples of how to work with nature, how to manage water, how to build resiliency into our everyday thought process? And back to the The client issue is, of course, you can talk money, right? So from a money standpoint, standard engineering process costs a certain amount for the pumps, the pipes, the infrastructure, the operations, maintenance, long-term replacement, et cetera, the power, et cetera. But and this is your product. You get a barrier between water and land. So if we could just take, the big U's, all of those elements of engaging that waterfront and making it work in a productive manner for the citizens that live next to it while handling the water, that is a economic benefit to the value of the property adjacent to the water versus I don't want to live next to the canal. It's ugly and it's ugly, right? That's about all you can say without bleeping, right? So by adding the green line in here, you reduce the overall impact on the infrastructure, your operations and maintenance costs go down, and at the same time, you create a system that allows the capacity to be greater. So you're able to handle more water with less money, plus you're adding all this community and public benefit, right? So a quick example of one of these waterways. This is, if you compare this back to the original canal with nobody on it, this is a waterfront Bree and I did in outside of Beijing, where we had to convince the client who they just wanted the seawall and the promenade. That's what they wanted. And we're like, no, we need to have a terraced landscape system that can absorb water from the land side, allow flooding of the river. And they're like, we don't want weeds along the river. And we're like, it's not weeds. So a lot of it is educating the client. A lot of them is to bring the detail about what those plants are, what they're going to look like when they bloom, how beautiful they are, the amphibians that are going to come. It's amazing, right? I go to this place and I'm like, I can't believe it. It's unbelievable, right? And the client now, it's unbelievable. So the other thing, of course, the public amenities, engaging that waterfront with people and the water and nature and having events, having programs, all the things that in the video everybody wants, right? I use this bottom right image. Which side of the canal do you want? That's the story to me. I want to be on the left-hand side where there's nature. So instead of building the high promenade that blocks the development from the water, let's lay the promenade back. The levee system still works. We handle several more feet of water. We increase the capacity of the canal. And the park system engages directly with the development, making the development a much richer environment, and it also increases that property value. So thinking about the conventional system, adding the structural layers to manage the water, promoting the proper landscape systems that can deal with the flooding while maintaining the public access. So we all of a sudden have safety, we have public amenity, we have more habitat, we have a better lifestyle. The city and the waterfront are really integrated. So in those larger interior park systems, to be able to, I love to do this, she just runs by, right, is, the flood season comes, the water comes in, the habitats grow, and we just all move forward. Getting to a finer grain of streetscapes, conventionally what happens is there is a large culvert under the street or sidewalk. Our proposal here on the left-hand side, actually put that underground, bring a public environment over it, program it, plant out the street, employ the proper systems for more pervious systems to recharge the aquifer. And again, it's about working with all these layers together that creates the proper harmony that then allows the politicians or the developers to realize how much better a proposal like this is, and that the short-term cost of doing it are far outweighed by the long-term value in creating an environment that people want to be in and want to live in. So, what do you guys do?
Yeah, so the question is really, how can all of you in the audience actually get involved in projects like this? It's not like we were resiliency experts that were actually called into Manhattan to help with it. The only thing that we really had as an experience was living in Denmark. And when you consider that Denmark is a series of 1,000 islands, that when you take the coastline of Denmark and stretch it all out, is the same as 2/3 of India. So it is actually a tiny little country with a huge waterfront or coastal footprint. And we took those experiences that were actually smaller projects like the Copenhagen Harbor Bath, like the Maritime Youth House. Each one of those were tiny little resilient projects that were trying to figure out how do we interact with that waterfront. And collectively, they gave us an experience level that we could bring to a project like the Big U. How can you get involved? Well, there are actually, I think, everywhere opportunities for you to get involved, like Changing Course. Changing Course was a competition that was held this past year and a half in the Mississippi River Delta, and it literally was asking, similarly to the Rebuild by Design, please offer us 100-year visions of how we can deal with water and with our ecosystem. And already Bree has and Alan have already outlined major sort of needs in the Mississippi Delta. And you can see that there are already many initiatives underway, like the 2012 Louisiana Coastal Master Plan. Yet those are oftentimes very policy-driven and very sort of, I would say, lacking in terms of vision. What we offer as a design community, engineers, landscape architects, are actually actionable, implementable visions. And that's what Changing Course was all about. It took the Coastal Master Plan and basically layered on visions that would build on those Coastal Master Plan. The Coastal Master Plan was saying, let's do something now and look towards the next 50 years. Then Changing Course comes and offers visions how the things that you do now could actually impact much longer term needs. And what was learned in this process is that erosion of our coastal condition is a fact. There is more and more of the river delta that's turning into water. Yet, there's so much sediment that comes down the Mississippi River, you could actually take that sediment and start to sort of very constructively create a new kind of protective barrier system that would limit that erosion. And so it was really thinking about how then you would also consider communities currently spread out over the entire delta. How could you actually start to navigate where those communities actually build in the next 50 to 100 years? So the teams were supported by both a leadership committee and a technical advisory board. And these two organizations made up of designers and policymakers, made up of engineers and civil as well as landscape, provided them guidance to actually, through an iterative process of meetings and coming with workshops, to actually get 3 teams that basically were funded. Again, not a single competition winner, but 3 teams, Baird Associates, Moffat and Nickel, and Studio Mississippi, all providing visions. And those visions were literally reconnecting the Mississippi River and its wetlands, creating an ecosystem and understanding that ecosystem, planning for smaller and more sustainable delta. It's shrinking, but let's start to see what areas of it we actually want to preserve. Cutting a deeper navigable channel, deeper into the Mississippi River, so that you can actually provide safer and more non-sort of weather dependent ports, so that the port, which is really the economic engine of that entire region, is protected. So thinking about how to retreat and to say that there will be some areas that are affected to some point, that those areas are no longer viable to be protected, talking about retreat. And so looking at how along the entire Mississippi Delta, you would create kind of very resilient communities that have and offer a huge recreational and a strong commercial backbone, and doing all of that over the phasing of 100 years. I think that's the kind of thinking, visionary thinking, that all of us in this room can actually provide. So we'd like to actually open this up now to questions and answers. And I think, Bree, why don't you MC the question answer
Okay.
session. So let's hear it from you guys.
We have 2 mics, if you wouldn't mind stepping up to the mic with your questions.
Yeah, this is being taped, so you're now on camera.
We just turned our questions into half what they were.
So you have great examples of what happens in a state like Texas where, if my understanding is correct, regulations are somewhat more flexible than in some communities. And then China, where you had a very sort of top-down attitude towards one thing. And then New York, where you had a very huge public awakening of need. For those of us who do a lot of work in communities that don't have any of those things, what do you suggest we do to help create a public sense of urgency around the need for resilience?
I'd like to take that. I think one of the most interesting developments that have come out of Rebuild by Design and the Rockefeller Foundation's work is something called 100 Resilient Cities. Those 100 resilient cities are actually everywhere and of every size. There is not a sort of mega region or a watershed delta or any of those. It's really about helping communities, big and small, deal with exactly those issues of how do we get started. And it's really about leadership, finding the right people in any kind of government, policy, or design community that can actually lead those discussions and sort of get consensus and educate the public about what resiliency means.
But we also see a lot of value in just multi-jurisdictional collaborations, because often these concepts or these challenges are unsolvable at the location where the impact is occurring. And finding opportunities to create larger frameworks for advancing these decisions. A great example is the organization BCDC that formed to protect the Bay in San Francisco when Phil was just coming in a rampant way. Ideally, we're not waiting for these sort of calamitous moments where the community organizes, but great leadership examples that actually show deep economic benefits and values are a really transformative way to approach these issues.
I think that depending on the scale of the community, and because we work at all different scales, it's very important to have the set of examples of other communities of similar sizes, because as creatures of habit and creatures of imitation, we learn by example, and by having good precedent examples. And even if it's just a neighborhood street that puts in a new sidewalk, that puts in a rain garden with the sidewalk to plant 6 trees, that's a great example for a small community or small town that can't look to Shanghai or New York as the model, right? But can look at a much smaller town or community that's done that and show how it works and how it benefits the public infrastructure, public utilities, lowers water costs, et cetera. So anything that relates to money and better lifestyle always are good examples.
We have another person that wants to be on camera.
Yeah. Come on stage.
My name is Jody Smits-Anderson, and I'm working on some resiliency policy in New York State. And I think this is more of a plea for help rather than a question. Competitions are fantastic and broaden our vision. I don't often see them informing policy. In fact, quite often the discussions we have are very rooted in the environment of the Department of Environmental Conservation or in energy focus solely. So in what way do you think we could start to bring that knowledge into actual policy work? And the second piece of that is, for example, the Hudson River is tidal all the way up to Troy, New York. So that entire river up to Troy is seacoast. New York State is adopting projections that have started to make people panic. They range from about 20 inches to up to 75 inches in New York City as a projection. How can we disseminate that information and give people the tools to see the opportunities as you've presented rather than the fear factor?
So on the policy level, it looks like I'm kind of pimping the Rockefeller Foundation, but the Rockefeller Foundation has actually also, as a second version of the Rebuild by Design, has now done another initiative that is looking at cities, and has opened up, I think, another funding, or the government has opened up another funding of $1 billion to assist communities, again, that are in the interior that have been affected by climate change within the last, I think it was 7 or 8 years. And what the Rockefeller Foundation did was to create resilient academies, where it was 1 to 2 day workshops where people who have had experience in resilient projects met with city officials to learn how to write funding applications of the federal government to seek that funding. Because you didn't actually have people within the government, the local governments, that knew how to word or how to kind of formulate ideas that would actually tap into that federal funding. So I think there are, maybe not enough, but there are efforts on that level to educate local people.
Part of the process too, really, is being able to reference success elsewhere just as a designer, right? You don't need to go kind of build in a multi-year process. You just need a couple of good ideas you can cross-reference. And hopefully part of what we've been able to offer you is a couple more in your toolkit, but it's essential that when you come and you're presenting these ideas that you're able to point to, hey, look, in New Orleans, they were able to show a 3x on the investment in green infrastructure, and look at what it created. Hey, over there in Houston, they did this project where density actually created an economic benefit.
Actually,
I think those precedent projects
if any of you guys take just a week-long trip to Holland, they've been living under the waterline for 400 or 500 years. You will see so many examples of actually how to deal with coastal water and get a whole catalog of experience. So that would probably be the most in-depth kind of study immersion that you could do, in addition to San Francisco, China, and New York.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Burrell-Jost with Thornton Tomasetti, and my question is, what's the role of data and specific technologies in the design process? For instance, are you using GSI, or what kind of things are you using? Thanks.
Well, for the engineering side of the process, GIS and geographic information mapping systems, where you can really clearly show watersheds and their relationship to your individual sites, are great tools. We're doing a lot of work in the city of New Orleans, and so much of this is interpreting fields and fields of numbers, and doing those kind of, remember those cartoons you looked at with the kid and you're like, what's the difference between the left and the right? A lot of it is just really subtle changes and detecting patterns. In particular, we're working on a 25-acre site that the nuns gave up on after it burned and then flooded by Katrina. They've decided to do something really different in New Orleans, and what we've been able to determine is by turning their site in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods, and Katrina can pull 3,000 homes out of the floodplain. And to be able to demonstrate that is both an art in terms of how we make something that the community actually wants and becomes an asset and is programmatically rich, but also is the science of how do you actually demonstrate through these very dynamic hydrological models how you're actually able to improve the impact and where, and then convince FEMA, right? And to be able to translate from that local technical to the national impact is really critical.
Thanks.
We have a minute and 20
we have
seconds left.
Two more questions.
Yeah, hi, Eddie Corwin with Google. I'm just curious, thinking about the Big U as an example. You create these beautiful spaces with a lot of grasslands and open areas. What type of considerations have been taken into account for post-event? So you build the space and another Sandy comes, all that beautiful grass dies. What type of considerations have been built in for that?
All right. I think I'd like to answer your question also with the other gentleman's about what can we do on a building versus kind of on a city scale. Imagine that every insurance company is requiring every property owner to basically flood-proof their building at the moment. And you can imagine that every single high-rise in all of Lower Manhattan is spending anywhere from $500,000 to $10 million right now to flood-proof their building. That's because we're thinking of it individually. We're thinking of it as site ownership. Now, what the Big U presents is a collective idea. We have to buy into a collective, agreed-upon idea that we're protecting the entire city. Now, if I were to kind of just thumb a price for the Big U, it'd be between $2 and $3 billion, the full 10 miles. How much are we spending if we do every single building, $500 to $10 million in the Lower Manhattan? We're spending 20, 30, 40 times that. So what the Big U presents is a collective buy-in from the citizenry, from the policymakers, from the individual voters, that this is a good way to think. As far as your question about what happens to all of those spaces, just as a car is designed to have crush zones to minimize the force of impact, view the Big U as a crush zone in a car, and that you basically are building a kind of berm that takes the force, the impact of the water coming at you and minimizes that impact. There will be, of course, grass and trees that need to be replaced, but that is that's minuscule to the cost of actually having to deal with all of the infrastructure issues that flooding would create.
I think we're out of time, so we can.
Last question.
All right.
One question. You guys have been great.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it quick. I'm Alex Katz. I'm working with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation we're consulting with them to help develop socioeconomic metrics for the $7 billion that was put into post-Hurricane Sandy natural resource restoration, resilience capacity. I guess since we've seen these great figures on what the benefits are after this work is already done, I'm curious on the front end for you guys, how do you think about what are the benefits of the work you're creating? What are the categories? How do you weigh different benefits and prioritize, things with, economic benefits versus social benefits?
I think the work, and it's published by Greater New Orleans, Inc., really does a thorough job at looking at all of these kinds of green infrastructural investments and quantifying the social and the economic in a very detailed way. And not every client has the same list of things that they judge by. And certain cities may look at things from a triple bottom line perspective and have a systematized way to do that, like the city of San Francisco. Developer clients, sometimes they want to know about the qualitative, but may really just be focused on the financial. And so being able to calibrate these within the context, but it's also critically important to be able to turn to some of the larger policy frameworks to defend the discrete and specific projects. And I would say the economic is always there, and it's America, come on. But then the environmental is certainly a strong one. The social and community aspects are really strong. And then some of the more intangible, the playful, the user experience, the quality of space become more and more important. And I think that's a testament to why firms like SOM and BIG have stepped into that space to really create meaningful approaches and responses. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everybody, for your time. And
Thank you.
Thank you.